The Reichstag thundered with applause as Hermann Göring puffed out his chest and made his vow. It was September 1939, the opening weeks of the war, and the Luftwaffe seemed invincible. With a mocking grin, he declared, "No enemy bomber can reach the Ruhr. If one does, you may call me Meyer." The room erupted in laughter. It was a moment of bravado, perfectly timed for a nation still giddy from rapid victories in Poland. No one yet imagined the skies above their capital turning red, or that the name Meyer would echo back at them with cruel irony. For the next 2 years, that boast held true. Luftwaffe Bf-19s had carved up the skies of Western Europe. German flak, the dreaded 8.8-centimeter guns with a ceiling of 26,000 feet, formed a steel canopy that discouraged any deep penetration by Allied bombers. In Berlin, civilians felt shielded by distance and technology. They lived their lives with ration cards tucked into kitchen drawers, confident that Hamburg's fate could never be theirs. But cracks were forming. In smoky beer halls along Unter den Linden, young cadets raised glasses of watery beer and scoffed at the stubby American B-17s, glimpsed in propaganda reels. Too slow, too clumsy, they said. Fortresses indeed, better coffins in the sky. It was easy to laugh when Berlin's nights were still dark and unbroken. One seamstress, Anna Kraus, left the theater one evening shaking her head at the jokes. She had seen the aftermath of the RAF's pinprick raids. Only weeks before, on January 30th, 1943, fast mosquito bombers had roared over Berlin in daylight, disrupting Göring's speech broadcast to the nation. If a few twin-engined raiders could humiliate the Reichsmarschall on his own anniversary parade, what would come next? She tucked her ration book into her purse and hurried home, wondering if she would one day clutch it in a cellar while the world burned above her. The first heavy raids began that November, and Berliners learned the sound that mocked them. Air raid sirens wailed across the city. Civilians called them Meyer's trumpets, a bitter reference to Göring's impossible promise. For hours, their notes wailed across the Tiergarten, echoing in stone stairwells, a reminder that the Reich's boast of invulnerability had expired. By the time Anna reached the basement of her apartment block on that November night, the earth already trembled with distant detonations. Smoke began filtering down the stairwell. Above, neighbors screamed as searchlight beams clawed across the night sky. Berlin had entered a new age of war. The joke was over. Far from the firestorms of Berlin, the Boeing plant number. 2 in Seattle pulsed with another kind of thunder. Rows of half-built fuselages stretched across the factory floor, their aluminum skins glinting under bright lamps. Women in coveralls and bandanas riveted steel with pneumatic hammers while teenage boys fetched tools. Every 25 hours, another bomber rolled out of the hangar. Where Germany built in hundreds, America built in thousands. It was here that the B-17 Flying Fortress truly earned its name. The G models now streaming from the line bristled with 13.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, set in chin, tail, top, and waist mounts. Each was a fortress in the sky, 103 feet of wingspan, 74 feet of fuselage, powered by 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, each delivering 1,200 horsepower. At 35,000 feet, the air was so thin crews breathed through oxygen masks, yet the fortress remained steady, carrying 6,000 pounds of bombs toward enemy heartlands. Among the new crews training for these machines was Robert "Rosie" Rosenthal, a Jewish lawyer from Brooklyn who had left behind courtroom battles for aerial ones. He had already earned a reputation in the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, for returning from missions few thought survivable. When he first walked across the wet English tarmac toward his assigned fortress, the bulk of the aircraft seemed otherworldly. He later recalled thinking it was less an airplane than a city in the sky. The numbers behind Rosenthal's bomber reflected the arsenal of democracy. Between 1939 and 1945, American factories produced 12,731 B-17s. Of these, 8,680 were the G model, each refined for survivability. By comparison, Germany's vaunted Me-262 jet fighters, technologically superior on paper, numbered barely 1,400 by war's end, many unfueled and pilotless. What the Reich built in desperation, America produced in abundance. Life and training mirrored that abundance. Crews received fresh coffee, powdered eggs, and Lucky Strike cigarettes before climbing aboard. Their pockets held Hershey bars and letters from home. For their counterparts in the Luftwaffe, fuel was rationed, cigarettes scarce, and bread cut thinner each month. The contrast was as stark as aluminum fuselages against a Berlin winter sky. Rosenthal studied the fortress with the mind of a lawyer and the soul of a volunteer. He noted the protective chin turret added after bloody lessons over Europe. He learned how waist gunners typically rotated shifts to prevent frostbite in -40 degrees Fahrenheit winds. He would later lead men through formations so dense that veterans compared them to aluminum overcast. By the time his training cycle ended, the laughter in Berlin seemed like another world. America had built not only a weapon, but a fleet, an industrial tide that no boast, however bold, could ever hold back. The air above Berlin was bitterly cold on January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power. Crowds gathered in squares to hear the Führer's voice carried on radio loudspeakers. Inside the city's broadcast studio, Reichsmarshal Göring prepared his own speech, full of boasts about Germany's strength. At that moment, the rumble of engines cut across the city. It was no Luftwaffe flyover. It was 3 RAF Mosquito bombers streaking low and fast, their Merlin engines roaring like wasps in the frost. They dropped bombs within earshot of the broadcast hall, the concussions rattling windows and throwing off the transmission. Göring's speech sputtered into static. The Reich's pride was publicly humiliated in its own capital. Young Luftwaffe pilot Hans Keller, then still in training, remembered the bitterness that rippled through his unit. They had sworn to keep Germany safe, yet a handful of British twin-engine pests had mocked their defenses. Keller's instructors assured them that the real battles lay ahead, that once Germany's heavy flak belts were reinforced and new fighters rolled out, no Allied bomber would escape. The confidence of the Luftwaffe remained unbroken, even as whispers of shortages in fuel and spare parts spread through the hangars. For Berlin civilians, the Mosquito raid was only an omen. By November of that year, the omen became reality. On the night of the 18th, Sir Arthur Harris, head of RAF Bomber Command, unleashed the first of what he called the Battle of Berlin. Hundreds of Lancasters crossed the North Sea, flying through flak and night fighter attacks, guided by the radar of Pathfinder squadrons. The bombs fell on the city's west, shattering Charlottenburg and Schöneberg, leaving blocks of apartments aflame. Anna Kraus huddled in the basement of her tenement, clutching her ration book. Neighbors prayed aloud, while dust sifted down from the ceiling. The roar outside was constant, an orchestra of engines, the crash of anti-aircraft fire, and the hollow thud of high explosives. When she emerged in the dawn light, entire streets were gone. Fire crews dragged hoses across smoldering cobblestones. The smell of burnt timber mixed with singed cloth and something far worse. The statistics from those first nights were staggering. Between November 1943 and March 1944, the RAF launched 16 major raids on Berlin. They lost more than 500 bombers, yet inflicted destruction that displaced hundreds of thousands of civilians. Entire districts vanished under rubble. For Berliners who had once laughed at Göring's swagger, the city's vulnerability was undeniable. Keller, now assigned to JG-11, prepared for the day when it would be his turn to face the bombers. He still believed skill and discipline could hold back the tide. What he could not know was that the tide itself was about to change scale entirely. The night of November 22, 1943 was dry and still, the kind of brittle air that carried sparks like kindling. Berliners who had learned to read the warnings knew trouble was coming. The radio crackled with reports. Bombers sighted over Hanover, then Magdeburg. Soon the sirens howled, the dreaded Meyer's trumpets. Families scrambled into shelters, clutching blankets, ration cards, and prayer books. Above them, the RAF sent waves of more than 700 bombers. Lancasters droned in tight streams, bomb bays opening to release high explosives first, then incendiaries. The bombs struck the western districts, Charlottenburg, Schöneberg, Spandau. High explosive blasts smashed water mains and ripped open roofs. Moments later, firebombs cascaded through the gaps, igniting attics, stairwells, and courtyards. The timing was deliberate. Explosions to cripple firefighting, flames to consume what remained. Anna Kraus felt heat even in the cellar. The air thickened, smoke pressing downward. Somewhere above, a neighbor screamed for a missing child. When at last the all-clear sounded, Anna emerged into a different city. Blocks had become infernos. Entire families lay silent under blankets of ash. She held her ration book, now smudged with soot, realizing how useless it was in a city where bakeries and warehouses had burned. The scale of destruction that night was beyond comprehension. Official reports counted 175,000 people rendered homeless in one raid. Thousands of small shops, theaters, and schools were gone. In 1 week alone, more than 4 million ration cards were destroyed, a statistic that captured the collapse of daily life more clearly than any casualty figure. Berliners, who once mocked Allied bombers as clumsy intruders, now picked through rubble for scraps of food. German defenses fought back ferociously. The 1st Flak Division, with its 440 heavy guns and hundreds of searchlights, filled the sky with orange bursts. Yet the bombers pressed on, guided by radar beacons. For every Lancaster shot down, another 10 dropped their loads. Losses were high. 44 British bombers failed to return that night, but the effect was decisive. Berlin, thought to be impregnable, had burned in a single evening. From his airfield, Hans Keller heard the reports. He imagined the walls of fire, the streams of refugees, the anger of his comrades. They would fly harder, he thought, train longer, and fight to push back the bombers. But as dawn revealed the smoking city, another truth emerged. No amount of courage could match the scale of steel and fire now arrayed against them. The morning of March 6, 1944, broke with a thin winter sun over eastern England. On airfields spread across East Anglia, the ground shook with the roar of radial engines as the 8th Air Force prepared to do what had been considered impossible: strike Berlin in daylight. Mechanics tightened cowling bolts, armorers loaded belts of .50 caliber rounds into Browning M2s, and crews ran gloved hands across frost-coated wings. The air was sharp, the kind that bit at skin and lungs, yet excitement buzzed among the formations of B-17 and B-24s lined up in neat rows. For Robert "Rosie" Rosenthal, the mission felt both inevitable and momentous. His crew of the 100th Bomb Group climbed aboard their fortress, adjusting oxygen masks and flak vests. They knew what awaited them, a gauntlet of flak and fighters. Still, they taxied out with the precision of a well-rehearsed orchestra. At 9 a.m., the bombers lifted off one by one, joining into streams of silver that stretched for miles. By the time they reached the continent, more than 670 bombers were airborne. The German defenses were waiting. Flak guns around the capital fired in disciplined patterns, black bursts filling the air like malignant blossoms. Fighters rose, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, hurling themselves at the bomber streams with 20mm cannons blazing. Inside the formations, waist gunners shouted bearings over intercoms, opening fire until the air smelled of burnt cordite. Crewmen shivered in -40°F winds, fingers numb even through heavy gloves, sweat freezing in oxygen masks. Losses mounted quickly. 69 American bombers failed to return that day, each carrying 10 men. Yet the rest pressed on, bomb sight crosshairs locked onto marshalling yards and factories within Berlin itself. For the first time in the war, Germany's capital was struck from the sky in broad daylight. Explosions rippled through the city center as thousands of tons of high explosives fell on rail yards and industrial zones. The significance was not lost on either side. For Americans, the raid proved the fortresses could reach Berlin, strike effectively, and return. For Germans, the myth of invulnerability shattered. Civilians who had endured night raids now looked up in disbelief at bombers glinting in the midday sun. Rosenthal's fortress limped back across the channel, engines coughing, flak holes punched through her skin. He knew the cost had been steep, but he also understood what it meant. Berlin had been pierced, and it would not be the last time. Hans Keller squinted through his canopy as his Bf-109 clawed upward over the Reich's heartland. His orders were clear: intercept the bomber streams before they reached Berlin. For months, he and his comrades had been trained to attack in head-on passes, firing cannons at the tight formations of fortresses. Losses had been severe, but the tactic sometimes worked. This morning, however, the sky looked different. High above the bomber streams, sleek silhouettes circled like hawks. They were Mustangs, North American P-51s with drop tanks slung under their wings. Until now, German pilots had counted on the long distances to Berlin. Allied fighters typically turned back near the Ruhr, leaving bombers exposed. Not today. As Keller's staffel closed, the Mustangs dove. Their Packard-built Merlin engines screamed as they unleashed .50 caliber fire. German formations scattered under the onslaught. Keller rolled hard, tracers whipping past, his wingman vanishing in a ball of flame. The tactical revolution had been simple, yet devastating. External fuel tanks. With them, the P-51's range extended to 1,650 miles, allowing continuous escort from English bases to Berlin and back. It meant the Luftwaffe could no longer mass unopposed against bombers. Every attack was met by swarms of agile American fighters. From the ground, Hermann Göring heard reports that Mustangs were escorting bombers over Hanover, then Berlin. Later, in Allied captivity, he admitted, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." His once vaunted Reich defense now bled pilots faster than replacements could be trained. The numbers told the story. By 1944, the 8th Air Force could send nearly 1,000 fighters alongside more than 1,000 bombers. In contrast, Germany's fighter output was collapsing. Fuel shortages and Allied bombing of synthetic plants crippled operations. Veteran pilots like Keller shouldered impossible burdens, flying sortie after sortie while watching inexperienced replacements perish within weeks. For the bomber crews, the change was tangible. Waist gunners watched Mustangs slash through German formations before they reached the bombers. Losses dropped, confidence rose, and missions that once seemed suicidal became survivable. The skies themselves were tilting. Keller returned to base that evening shaken. The bombers had made it through, their escorts unbroken. For the first time, he felt the weight of inevitability pressing down, heavier than his flight gear. The air over Berlin no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. In 1944, in war rooms and boardrooms alike, the numbers began to tell their own story. Charts projected on briefing walls showed American aircraft production climbing like a vertical line, while Germany's flattened into a desperate plateau. The U.S. had produced nearly 96,000 aircraft that year alone. Fighters, bombers, transports, more than double what the Luftwaffe could muster. Factories in Seattle, Long Beach, and Fort Worth ran around the clock, their shifts filled with men too old to fight and women who had never before worked with metal. Every 20 minutes, somewhere in America, another bomber rolled off the line. This was not just industry, it was strategy. The U.S. War Department understood that attrition was a weapon. Where Germany lost a single fighter pilot, his years of training and irreplaceable experience vanished. Where America lost a bomber, another could be delivered within days, crewed by trained airmen from an endless pipeline of recruits. The impossible statistic became reality. In 1 month, American factories scrapped more damaged B-17s than Italy had combat aircraft in its entire service. Waste on this scale would have been scandal in Germany. In America, it was simply arithmetic, the cost of victory. On the front lines of production, assembly lines became as critical as frontline trenches. At Douglas's Santa Monica plant, Mechanics installed engines on B-17's under banners that read, "Victory through production." At Lockheed Vega in Burbank, final inspections checked bomb racks before new fortresses were ferried overseas. In Germany, by contrast, workers dismantled bombed-out factories and tried to move them underground, but constant raids made consistency impossible. Hans Keller, recovering between missions, read in unit bulletins how new models of fighters were promised: jets, rocket interceptors, but few arrived, and those that did sat idle for lack of fuel. He and his comrades flew aging Bf-10-9Gs patched together with salvaged parts, while the Americans seemed to have an endless fleet of shiny Mustangs and Fortresses. The imbalance gnawed at him more deeply than fear of the next mission. For the bomber crews, the abundance was felt in smaller, human ways. Breakfast of hot coffee and powdered eggs before missions. Spare flak jackets piled in ready rooms. Even chocolate bars tucked into flight suits as morale tokens. To German civilians, queuing hours for bread or scraping coal dust for heat, such abundance was unimaginable. By late 1944, it was no longer a question of if Berlin would be struck again, but how often and with what weight of steel and fire. The avalanche of production guaranteed the answer. The morning of February 3, 1945, dawned cold and clear across East Anglia. Crews of the 8th Air Force strapped into their Fortresses and Liberators for what would become the largest raid yet against Berlin. Engines thundered in unison, and soon more than 1,500 heavy bombers, escorted by 1,000 fighters, filled the skies in streams that stretched horizon to horizon. From the ground, the formations looked like migrating steel geese, sunlight glinting off their wings. At the head of one Pathfinder formation flew Robert Rosenthal, by now a seasoned veteran of more than 50 missions. His B-17G, serial number 44-8379, carried radar equipment to guide the stream. He knew the target, rail yards, and government districts in the city's heart. Orders from General Spots and Doolittle emphasized crippling transport links and breaking administrative command. For Rosenthal, a Jewish American, the strike carried deeper resonance. Berlin represented the ideology that had built the camps. As the formations approached, Berlin's flak batteries erupted. Hundreds of heavy guns, 88s, 105s, even 128mm monsters on concrete towers, sent shells bursting at 20,000 feet. The sky turned black with smoke and orange with detonations. Crews gritted teeth as fragments rattled off aluminum skins. One waist gunner counted 12 holes in his section before they even reached the bomb run. Yet the bombers pressed forward, guided by radar through haze. Bomb bay doors opened and thousands of bombs tumbled downward. In minutes, the city shook under 4.5 million pounds of high explosives. Rail hubs in Friedrichstadt and Luisenstadt vanished in rolling detonations. Government ministries collapsed into rubble. Fires spread through tenement blocks, while thousands of civilians fled into freezing streets. Official counts later recorded 2,894 dead, 20,000 wounded, and 120,000 left homeless in a single day. The destruction was surgical compared to Dresden's firestorm a week later, yet its impact was no less profound. Rail traffic stalled, administration faltered, and civilian morale cracked further. For Berliners who once mocked the flying fortress, the sight of 1,500 bombers at midday was the final humiliation. Rosenthal's ship limped home with engines coughing, holes punched through wings, but still flying. His crew fell silent as the city receded behind them, smoke curling into the winter sky. They had survived, but the image of burning Berlin stayed with them. On the ground, Hans Keller watched in despair as his squadron's efforts achieved almost nothing. German fighters had been swept aside by swarms of Mustangs. He knew then what his leaders refused to admit aloud. The Reich could no longer defend its capital. On the evening of February 13, 1945, while Berlin still smoldered from its daylight beating, another German city prepared for what locals thought would be a quiet night. Dresden, the Florence on the Elbe, had been largely spared the war's full fury. Its Baroque spires and crowded squares still bustled with refugees from the east, people who believed the city's cultural treasures protected it. That illusion ended when the sirens screamed at 10 p.m. The first wave of more than 240 Royal Air Force Lancasters swept in under moonlight. They dropped a mix of high explosives and thousands of incendiaries. The same two-step tactic honed over Hamburg and Berlin: smash the water mains, then light the tinder. Within minutes, the city center ignited. A second wave followed hours later, compounding the destruction. By the morning of February 14th, vast sections of Dresden were aflame, and when the U.S. 8th Air Force struck again that day, the firestorm consumed everything in its path. Survivors later spoke of hurricane winds that pulled people off their feet, of cellars turned into ovens, of tram lines melted into the cobblestones. Estimates after the war placed the death toll around 25,000 in those 2 nights, an almost incomprehensible number compressed into such a short span. Where Berlin's daylight raid had displaced 120,000, Dresden's firestorm obliterated entire neighborhoods, leaving little more than ash and skeletal walls. For Berliners like Anna Kraus, who heard the news on whispered radio reports, Dresden's fate was confirmation of what might have been. Their city had suffered under both RAF and USAAF raids, but the precision daylight strikes and weather conditions had spared them a true firestorm. Still, they knew it could come, and every new air raid warning stirred terror that Berlin might yet suffer Dresden's fate. From the Luftwaffe perspective, the devastation deepened despair. Hans Keller's comrades spoke of the impossibility of fighting an enemy who could incinerate a city at will. Jets like the Me-262 promised salvation, but few reached operational squadrons, and those that did lacked fuel. Watching photographs of Dresden's ruins passed around the squadron hut, Keller realized the war had shifted irreversibly. For the Allies, Dresden underscored the scale of their air power. A single raid could level a cultural capital in hours. It was proof that industrial democracy, through relentless production and systematic tactics, now wielded destruction beyond even what totalitarian Germany had once imagined. By May 1945, Berlin lay in ruins, occupied by Soviet troops. Hermann Göring, once the Reich's flamboyant Reichsmarschall, now sat in an Allied interrogation room, stripped of medals and power. Chain-smoking, bloated from years of indulgence, he faced questions about when he realized Germany had lost the air war. His answer was blunt: when the American long-range fighters were able to escort the bombers as far as Hanover and then to Berlin. We then knew we must develop the jet planes. But it was too late. The admission carried the weight of irony. This was the same man who had sworn no bomber would ever reach German soil. The same commander who had dismissed the flying fortress as a lumbering target. Now, in defeat, he confessed that the sight of Mustangs over Berlin had sealed Germany's fate. The boastful Reichsmarschall had been undone not by genius tactics, but by American persistence, production, and innovation. For Hans Keller, the story needed no retelling. He had seen Mustangs slice through his staffel, had watched his wingmen die in blazing wreckage. By 1945, Keller flew patched-up aircraft with dwindling fuel, his missions less about defense and more about survival. His war ended when his base was overrun by Soviet tanks, his comrades scattered to captivity. Rosenthal, by contrast, ended his war with 52 missions behind him. On that February day, he had led bombers directly over the capital of Nazism. For a Jewish American, the moment was both personal and historic, a testament to what free men, properly equipped, could accomplish against tyranny. The numbers by then were insurmountable. The U.S. had built nearly 300,000 aircraft, while Germany's production collapsed under constant bombing. In the final months, the Luftwaffe could not even fuel what few aircraft remained. Göring's confession was not revelation but confirmation. The Reich had been buried under an avalanche of American steel. As interrogators scribbled notes, Göring flicked ash into a tray, perhaps remembering the thunder of sirens once dubbed Meyer's trumpets. His empire of boasts had crumbled. His air force, once the pride of Europe, had been shattered by bombers he once mocked. The irony was complete. In the spring of 1945, Allied commanders spread maps across oak tables and marked thick red arrows pushing deep into Germany. The Soviet offensive from the east and the Anglo-American push from the west squeezed the Reich into a shrinking pocket. Yet the silent partner in every advance was the air. The Reich's arteries, railroads, bridges, factories had been smashed so thoroughly that the German army could scarcely maneuver. Berliners felt it daily. Bread lines stretched for blocks, punctuated by the wail of fresh sirens. Anna Kraus waited with her neighbors for rations that never seemed to arrive, shivering in her patched coat as smoke still drifted from distant ruins. 4 million ration cards had been destroyed in the November raids alone, and now even those that survived were little more than paper promises. The city that once sneered at enemy bombers now lived from raid to raid, hoping each all clear meant one more day alive. The scale of bombing was staggering. By war's end, Allied forces had dropped 1.5 million tons of bombs on Europe, much of it on Germany itself. The 8th Air Force alone dispatched more than 500,000 bomber sorties. No city, no industrial zone, no transportation hub remained untouched. Rail traffic through Berlin ground to a halt after the February raids. Coal shipments dwindled. Weapons factories operated at a fraction of capacity. The Luftwaffe's decline was just as stark. From more than 3,000 operational fighters in 1943, by April 1945 barely a few hundred could take off, many for lack of fuel. Keller, once a confident pilot eager to defend the Reich, now found himself grounded more often than flying. In his last weeks, he watched his squadron's aircraft stripped for parts, the men ordered to fight as infantry. The empire of the air had collapsed into dust. Meanwhile, American production lines still hummed. Shipyards launched Liberty vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. Aircraft factories produced more planes in a month than Germany built in a year. It was not only overwhelming force, but also overwhelming consistency. A democratic system that turned citizens into workers, workers into producers, and producers into victors. For the Allies, the lesson was clear. Air superiority was not an accessory to strategy. It was the strategy. Once the skies belonged to the fortresses and their escorts, the ground war became a matter of time. When Robert Rosenthal finally stepped off a troop ship back onto American soil in mid-1945, he carried the weight of 52 missions across Europe. Behind him lay the memory of Berlin's ruins, the sound of flak hammering against aluminum, the faces of men who had not returned. Before him stretched a different sight, fortresses lined up in desert boneyards, row upon row of machines no longer needed. Thousands of bombers that once shook the Reich now sat in silence, a monument to the sheer abundance that had made victory possible. The statistics defied imagination. The United States had built nearly 296,000 aircraft during the war, including more than 31,000 heavy bombers. Germany had never produced even a fraction of such numbers, and by 1945 its fuel and pilots were gone. The war was not won by courage alone, though courage was never lacking. It was won by an industrial democracy that turned factories into arsenals and everyday citizens into warriors of production. For Rosenthal, the victory was personal. As a Jewish American, he had helped strike at the heart of the ideology that built the camps. Each mission over Berlin was more than a military operation. It was justice delivered at 20,000 feet, yet he never forgot the cost. The bloody 100th alone lost hundreds of airmen, their names etched into memorial rolls. Each fortress that did not return was a city of 10 souls erased from the sky. Anna Kraus, now a survivor in a broken Berlin, picked through rubble for food. She no longer laughed at Göring's promises or the mockery of American bombers. For her, victory meant survival, the slow work of rebuilding, and the memory of sirens, that would never leave her ears. The legacy of those years echoed beyond the ruins. The doctrine forged in the skies over Berlin shaped the Cold War to come, embedding the idea that air superiority was the foundation of modern warfare. More than that, it proved that free societies, given purpose and resources, could overwhelm tyranny, not just with soldiers, but with the engines of freedom, factories, assembly lines, and the will to produce on a scale the world had never seen. When Rosenthal visited reunions decades later, the old veterans would still listen for a sound that once defined their youth. 4 Cyclone engines droning in harmony, the heartbeat of the flying fortress. To them, it was the sound of democracy's victory.